Hello and welcome back to HEMAFightBreakdowns. Today I'm going to be breaking down the gold medal match of Kepinator between Rasmus Ronigan and Joachim Hammerschlatt. And apologies in advance if I mispronounced every single word that I just said. But I'm not just covering this fight just because it is a gold medal match, and I'm not just covering it because it is a best of three, which is something that I'm really hoping a lot of tournaments in the future start copying. I'm covering this also because it is a very great demonstration of offensive tactics versus defensive tactics, and specifically kind of adaptations that you can make without leaving your requisite category. Something you've probably heard me say a lot on this channel before is that I myself am a very defensive fighter, and I struggle to get myself out of that category. It would be very, very useful to me if I was able to become a more offensive fighter, because it would open up all kinds of tools for me to be able to capitalize on other people's defensive fighting, or to be able to recover from other people's aggressive fighting that's currently beating me. But in this fight, we see two people who, in my opinion, just like me, are really stuck in their category. Rasmus is an extremely defensive fighter who almost always goes for the parry riposte off of the initial attack, and Hammerschlatt is an extremely aggressive fighter who almost always goes for a headshot as his opening action. And throughout this entire fight, which was 15 long exchanges over 3 short minutes, you're never going to see much of a deviation from that. However, I want to go over this fight and all of these little adaptations because it's important to understand that there are some very subtle changes that you can make and stay within your category that can still help you bail yourself out of whatever situation you happen to be in, whether you're the aggressive fighter who keeps getting parry riposted or whether you're the defensive fighter who keeps getting stuffed. So looking at our first exchange, we have a great pace setter. Hammerschlatt comes in with a big aggressive shot toward the head, and Rasmus looks for his parry riposte. And what appears to be, in this particular instance, he gets it. He manages to kind of do a little bit of a cron parry on his right side, Zverk underneath, land that shot. And the important thing that you need to pay attention to isn't just the interaction of these two, basic loops, but the fact that Hammerschlatt has some follow-ups as well as Rasmus. Hammerschlatt's plan, clearly from this instance, is to throw that big headshot, and then, assuming that it gets parried, to shove his hands forward and try to stuff the follow-up with a very heavy overbind. And this is a really good idea, one that probably works most of the time, not only because Hammerschlatt appears to be very tall, but also because overbinds are really, really good at stuffing Zverkhaus. Parry ripostes lend themselves very nicely to Zverkhaus. So the fact that Hammerschlatt has this built-in loop here means that he is very experienced in not only having his initial strikes parried, but he's very experienced in knowing exactly what to do to try to prevent that follow-up from coming through. So this is really the stage that comes in for this second fight. And I say second fight because this was the second fight of the 3 that they had because it was a gold medal match. So there's already a bit of adaptation going on. So Rasmus gets his parry riposte. Joachim knows that he can't really necessarily go in with that big heavy headshot every single time, but we have to see what adaptations they make based on this starting point. Now, normally I'd move on to the second exchange, but as I mentioned earlier, there are 15 of them and we can't cover them all. But also I'm going to jump from number 2 all the way to number 7, specifically because this is the point where I really believe that a change gets made. So what you can see here by the score on the top left, which thankfully was put on this live stream, Rasmus has been very, very successful in parry riposting, and Hammerschlatt has not been very successful in being able to stuff that parry riposte. So what do we see that's different in this exchange? Well, on the one hand, not much, but on the other hand, the adjustment is subtle but still effective. Hammerschlatt goes from throwing an opening cut towards the head of his opponent to throwing a big ballistic thrust. Now, what are the key differences between these two opening attacks? Well, for a cut, a parry riposte has to defend one of these offside quadrants. A thrust, you have to defend the center line. In order to stop someone from stabbing you in the face, you have to take them from the middle to the side. In order to stop them from cutting you in the head, you have to start on the side, and then you have a choice to either cut across the middle or go all the way around. So one of the benefits of throwing a thrust down the middle is A, your opponent has to use a different defense, and maybe their defense against cuts is significantly better than it is against thrusts. But also there's another key component, and that is you force your opponent to move their hands from their center line to their offline, and it gives them a very different set of options to use as a repost, assuming that they do parry you. And I believe Hammerschlat here did assume that he was going to be parried. The idea here is that when you throw a thrust and you're driving straight down the middle, your ability to crash into your opponent's center of gravity is significantly increased. If you are throwing a cut off to the side, your hands are going to be stuck also off to the side, and they have to now transition to another more advantageous grapple point in order to get those really solid overbinds. Essentially, if you get parried on the outside because you threw a cut, you now have to move your hands to wherever you think your opponent's follow-up is going to come from. And that's a little bit of a guessing game. But when you throw a thrust straight down the pipe, you can drive your crossguard basically directly into their shoulder line or into their neck, and you can know for sure that you're going to stuff their hands no matter where they go. And as you see in this exchange, Rasmus's ability to throw a follow-up Zwerkow was significantly more stuffed than it ever has been. As a result, Hammerschlat was better able to throw a follow-up after he got into his successful stuff, and he was able to get the better part of a 2.1 point differential. Now, we're going to move on immediately to the next exchange, the 8th exchange, because it's a rather short one, but a very important one in displaying another advantage that comes from switching up your initial offense from a cut to a thrust, or really vice versa. The idea here is that when you switch from a cut to a thrust, you're changing the position that your opponent has to put their hands in order to defend themselves. But one of the real problems with changing your hand position where it starts is that it also leaves you open to the opposite attack that you were just parrying and riposting successfully before. Rasmus has been very successful so far in defending those cuts to his head and then throwing a very nice Zwerkow underneath, but he just got thrusted really hard towards the head and had to defend that in a completely different way. So he's changed his starting position. He's keeping his hands more towards the center, which means that if Hammerschlat comes in with another big thrust, he doesn't have to go to the center, engage with the blade, and then shove it offline, saving him some crucial steps and saving him some crucial time. But in keeping his hands toward the center of his chest, he is leaving the sides of his head open, which means Hammerschlat can go immediately back to what he loves to do most and throw that initial entry cut and land it. This kind of mind game, where if you got someone who is reacting to everything that you do in a very defensive manner, is the best kind of game plan that you can have as an aggressive fencer. And it's really only these tiny adjustments within your aggressive game plan that can be so very successful. All you have to do is know, hey, what do I love to do every single time? Well, maybe only do it 50% of the time. Because every time that I change what I do in my opening attack sequence is another sequence where my opponent has to essentially guess. They have to guess what I'm throwing in my entry attack, and if they guess wrong, they're going to get hit by something they don't want to get hit by. And most importantly, they're going to get hit by something they probably could very effectively parry riposte under different circumstances. This ability to dictate the pace of the fight is part of what makes being an aggressive fencer so effective, and is partly why Hammerschlat has been able to pull back a 7-3 deficit to a 7-7 tie. So at this point, it is Rasmus's turn to adapt. And as you can see, based on the score and the timer, we're skipping around again. But what makes this particular exchange very important is that we see an adaptation on the side of Rasmus that is still defensive oriented. Part of what I said at the beginning here is that the adjustments we're going to see from both of these fencers are very, very subtle, and it keeps them within their niche. And this is important to understand because for the most part, I just got done explaining how being an aggressive fencer is such a dominant position to be in when you're fighting someone defensive. But that doesn't mean that the defensive fighter has no options and has no ability to take control of the pace of the fight. What Rasmus does here is a perfect demonstration of how someone who is constantly reacting to what their opponent is doing can still be dictating the pace and more specifically the range of the engagements that are happening. And in this particular instance, Rasmus does this by changing his starting position to almost a Bicorno style position. Basically a position where instead of having your long point out, down low, maybe a little bit by your hips, he pulls his sword up almost completely to the level of his shoulders, retracts it somewhat, and aims his point directly at his opponent's chest. Now, why is this a good adaptation? Well, as we talked about earlier, one of the significant problems that Rasmus is facing right now is that Hammerschlatt is changing up between thrusts and cuts, and it's very, very difficult without guessing to know exactly which one is coming, and it's very difficult to defend one if you guess wrong and try to defend for the other. This particular position is very, very good at defending against thrusts, and it's much better, though not perfect, at defending against the exact same kinds of cuts that he's been facing. The reason for this is that from this retracted Bacorno position, if someone throws a cut, you can kind of punch your sword towards where it's coming from the retracted position to an extended position, and keep your horizontal crossguard there so that you're defended in your area of your hands, and you're probably going to prevent them from getting the overbind they want that's going to basically dictate the rest of their exchange. At the same time, if they throw a thrust, because you are already in this retracted shoulder height position, you are in the best position to throw a beeline thrust straight down the pipe directly into their face. Meaning that if they deviate from their path of the center line on their thrust, you're going to have the dominant line, you're going to stab them, and they might stab you back, but you're going to have the better range. At the exact same time, if they try to push your blade out of the way, recognizing that they're about to get stabbed, they have a very difficult time doing so because you have so much forward momentum going straight at them that they have to put significantly more momentum to the side in order to get you away, resulting in a lot of situations where someone comes in, tries to thrust through your Bacorno, and just ends up getting skewered right in the chest. And that's basically what happens here. Rasmus takes this Bacorno guard, he immediately thrusts it directly at Hammerschlatt right as Hammerschlatt starts taking his big step forward, and as a result, Hammerschlatt's own cut is just completely deflected off to the side and is made useless, and that thrust goes straight into the chest, at least as far as what I can see, and bends pretty significantly before it bounces out. At this point, everything that happens afterward is nullified because, of course, Rasmus got his points. But what's important to consider here also is that Hammerschlatt still tries to do his overbind and finds that it is a very, very bad position to be in when he manages to get it through. So even in the situation in which Hammerschlatt had thrown his opening attack, Rasmus hadn't landed his thrust, he still wouldn't have been able to execute his game plan very effectively, which means Rasmus has found a really, really effective adaptation. So we come now to the final exchange, and yes, I did skip some exchanges to reach the final exchange, but the reason I want to cover this one is one, because it's 10-10. It is tied, and this is the opportunity now for each person to try to really utilize their adaptations to get on top of what they know is going to occur in this final exchange. This is normally the part where I would say both people need to pull out the wackiest crap they've ever thrown in their life. If there was ever a time to throw a Geisling, it would be now. You know for a fact that Hammerschlatt is going to come in and throw a big cut or a big thrust towards your face. Now's the time to just throw something in his leg and run the hell away, because he's going to run right into it. At the exact same time, Hammerschlatt, if there was ever a time to go for a cheeky hand snipe off of your big aggressive attacks, now would have been the time. But that's not what we see from either fencer. Instead, what we see is a pretty classic play out of the same exchange we really saw all the way back in exchange number 1. Hammerschlatt comes in with a big attack. Rasmus parries, tries to get a sneaky Zwerk under the right side, and does look like he manages to land it pretty well. At the exact same time as this is happening, Hammerschlatt is trying to stuff those Zwerkaus by shoving his hands into his opponent's hands and getting a nice overbind over the top that prevents any kind of real dominant motion. At which point, he pivots off to his right side, and as he's exiting the exchange, tries to snipe the hands of his opponent in a nice little motion where he hits his hands and then leaves the exchange, guaranteeing him some clean points. So the question is, A, did the initial attack from Hammerschlatt land? I don't know. It looks really close. It definitely could have, but I don't know. Did the Zwerkau land with enough rotation and enough force? I don't know. It was definitely overbound pretty hard, and I think in a weird way it was simply a coincidence that Hammerschlatt was already moving to his right when that Zwerkau came through, so it might have accidentally relieved some of the pressure on top of the hands just as the Zwerkau was coming in, which would have given it enough space and time and maneuverability to actually land properly, but I don't know. And then, of course, the final hand snipe does actually look pretty good, but at this point, there's already 2 different things that could have happened, and it basically doesn't count. At the end of this exchange, they do give the 2 points to Rasmus for the cut to the body, and I can't tell them that they're wrong. But what matters here is that We saw a fight where two people who, again, stayed in their lanes of aggressive and defensive, made subtle adaptations in order to make their basic game plan work. And at the end of this fight, it was Rasmus who was better able to implement his parry riposte game than Hammerschlatt was able to implement his attack, counterattack, and stuff routine. But at the end of the day, it came down to the final exchange tied at 10-10, which really tells me that at the end of the day, if you are the kind of person who is stuck in their lane, again, like myself, you need to be able to really focus on these tiny adaptations because they are, in reality, the only way that you're ever going to be able to perform consistently against people who are at your level. People who are not much better than you or are just not as good as you, at the end of the day, you're going to be able to rely on your basic loop. You're always going to be able to land those initial attacks, and you're going to be able to pave over any kind of holes in your game with just that. And if you're, again, like me, not able to get out of that routine, these tiny little adaptations are absolutely essential. If you don't have any tiny little adaptations that supplement your game, you basically have nothing but an entry attack and a hope and a prayer. Or you have a parry riposte and a hope and a prayer, which essentially means you have nothing. So if you want to make sure that you don't have nothing, feel free to keep watching some of these videos. I'm going to be going over more high concept techniques and applications in the future, and I hope to see you there.